can get started. So I'll just do a quick intro. Um, Guys, this is Kimberly. He and I kind of met over discussing my article that I had written on Substack. That's kind of how we first like started talking. We've been following each other on Twitter for a little while. Aaron is also trans, and he's got a very unique perspective on like especially FTM issues. So we thought it'd be good to kind of like get a meeting together and talk about just our different perspectives on it. Aaron, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit and just like tell everybody a little bit about yourself in case they don't know you, and then yeah, we can get into it.
Sure. I started taking testosterone in 2006. So it's been roughly just under 20 years that I've lived as a trans man. I'm also a registered nurse and specializing in psychiatry. I've worked in inpatient units and in the community. And just for some context, that's where I initially became concerned. Is I was meeting with quite a few youth. At one point, about 30% of the youth that were coming to our clinic were trans-identified and wanting hormones. And we wanted to support them to the best of our ability. Our physicians weren't very familiar with gender-affirming care, but they were interested in learning. And when I started to assess the youth, my role, we weren't a gender clinic. We were a general multi-service clinic specializing in the care of youth. So we offered mental health, primary care, social services, trying to pack as many different services under one roof as possible to facilitate easy access for the youth. And I was still under the impression that we would be doing comprehensive assessment, which was done when I transitioned. And I do feel that's best practice, especially with young people. And so I was alarmed by a couple of things. One is that we were encouraged to not do much of any assessment at all, that no diagnosis for gender dysphoria was required. And my understanding of what gender dysphoria is differs from the current narratives. I believe that there are multiple pathways to gender dysphoria. I think we all have individual reasons for why we take this step. And I think those reasons should be explored with people. And, I don't think that the homosexual type of incongruence and autogynephilia are the only two reasons that people do this. But I do think that those two pathways are real and exist. And when someone does fit either of those categories, I think as patients, we have a right to understand the nature of our experience and factor that into why we make the decisions that we make. So because I was wanting to do assessment and because I do believe that there are different pathways, I was immediately blacklisted and branded as a bigot, which is disturbing because I cared a lot about these youth. And when I started to assess them, I was brought in as an assessor. My main role there was as clinical supervisor for a walk-in counseling program, but I was pulled in to do assessment. And I found the youth very highly complex. And some of them, I would say a small minority did match either the homosexual pathway or autogynephilia, but the majority of them didn't. And a lot of them came from trauma backgrounds and, from foster care and had multiple comorbid diagnoses like autism or ADHD. And given that they were minors, when I would ask questions like, how do you imagine your future? What do you think? What do you want your life to look like when you're 30 or 40 or 50? And given both their age as young people and given some of their diagnoses like autism, they weren't able to really imagine a future for themselves. And that's concerning when we're talking about consent to permanent alterations to your body. You need to be able to think in the future and what you want for your future. So I had multiple concerns about the youth that I was seeing and wanted to really slow down, take my time, get to know them. and offer them whatever we could to improve their quality of life, because I did have access to all these other services like housing and mental health care and primary care, and so wanted to do really individualized care plans for each youth and address their concerns. So I was disturbed by that model of care. I mean, I still identified as a trans man. It's not that I hate trans people and wanted to pathologize them, but it just what I was seeing when you're in the room with these youth, and you can tell like they haven't really thought this through, that they can't even imagine what their life's going to be like in 10 years. It's hard to feel confident to just rubber stamp them all. And so that's when I first started speaking publicly, and my concerns at that time were specifically about the model of care. But since then, because I have been in the public conversation and listening and just sort of tracking how all of this is playing out, listening to the trans activists, listening to the radical feminists and all these other warring factions in this conversation, understanding the complexity of how this is all playing out in society, and that there are different ways of thinking about this. And I enjoy conversations. I am willing to change my mind about things as I learn more, and my perspectives have changed a lot since 2019. And I was as a lesbian, and because I was 33 when I transitioned, as a lesbian through my late teens, early 20s, and into my early 30s, I was a lesbian feminist, and at one time had that feminism had informed my self-concept and how and my definition of gender, and understanding our experiences through that framework of we live within a patriarchy, we live within systems of female oppression. And I think that is a factor in why many women, in particular lesbians, take steps to medicalize.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate you giving me all that information. One second, let me just here. Okay, that's a lot, and I really appreciate that because it's really really interesting. I guess I can ask a few questions just about that. I guess one of the later things you said, you transitioned when you were 33. What kind of like influenced that decision? Because I guess people often stigmatize like transitioning later in life. They see it as like oh, you know, there might be something else going on there if you're only realizing this now. I know I read on your website you've had some like health complications, I think. Did that have any influence on your decision to do that?
My decision to medicalize, or my decision to stop testosterone, the medical complication?
To medicalize, pardon me.
Yeah. I think why we make this choice is often very complex. I'm still digging through a lot of it. I'm still unpacking a lot of it and exploring it. And because I've returned to feminism, grappling with my own decisions through that lens. And I did have the childhood experience of incongruence. That is a very real experience. It started when I was about age 3. I was highly gender nonconforming and believed that I either was a boy or that some mistake had been made that I was supposed to be. And we had really no, at least I didn't have any framework through which to understand that. And that persisted through my childhood. It's not that I was obsessed with gender. I mean, I'm 52, so we didn't have social media yet. I grew up in a small, isolated farming community. So it wasn't socially influenced in any way. It was just a spontaneously, organically occurring thing that happened to me in isolation of the gay lesbian community or teaching about it. Or I grew up in a very conservative environment where gender roles and expectations were quite conservative and limited. Homosexuality was very taboo. It wasn't something that was openly discussed. And I was kind of forced outed when I was 16. I sort of had this, we weren't exactly dating, but I had a relationship with a girl, and that was discovered. And so I was forced outed and I was bullied quite badly. And as a kid, there was quite a lot of room to be a tomboy without too much hassle. I would have kids come up to me on the playground saying things like, I'm confused because you look and sound and act like a boy, but people are telling me you're a girl. So what's going on? So those conversations were awkward, but I wasn't bullied. I had lots of friends. I prided myself on getting along with just about everybody. But in adolescence, and this is something I'm reading through Judith Halberstam's, or Jack in air quotes, Halberstam's book on female masculinity. Again, I had read it back in the 90s, and she talks about that fact that tomboyism or gender nonconformity is like fairly accepted as children, but when you're an adolescent, that changes. And there was far less tolerance for my gender nonconformity as an adolescent, and other people read correctly that gender nonconformity meant that I was a lesbian, and so the homophobic bullying that I encountered was quite severe.
It's interesting. I don't mean to cut in. You have there's a lot of similarities between our experiences. I'll say that much up front. Conservative background, having a naturally occurring like gender incongruence and everything. So it's very, very interesting. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Continue, but yeah.
And that correlation is documented in the literature. Like if you go back and look at older books and papers from like the 80s, that it was fairly well understood that gender dysphoria tends to be more severe and persist in cultures that are more conservative. And that's something when I did the transparency podcast, that's something that we noticed is the number of people that we had on who were willing to talk to us, and how many of them said they grew up in conservative Christian backgrounds.
Yeah.
So from a feminist perspective, that makes sense. I think that the more strict and punitive that thing called gender, I don't think of gender as something we have. It's a societal construct that's imposed upon us as expectations and roles, and we're punished for not conforming to those expectations of what a girl is supposed to be. And so anyway, so when I was 18, well, when I was 16, I started taking the bus to the city and connecting with lesbian community. And when I was 18, I moved to the city. And through feminist theory and just my relationships with other lesbians, that sense of incongruence started to make sense to me as a lesbian experience. It wasn't something that I remember being openly discussed very much, but I hung out with a wide range of different lesbians, including very butch lesbians, some that were more butch than I was. So that sense of incongruence, I wouldn't say ever went away, but I started to make sense of it as something that homosexuals experience. And so it started to wrap that into a lesbian identity. And then as a young university student in the early 90s, I started to study queer theory. And queer theory at that time was still very rooted in sex and sexual orientation. I mean, Judith Butler's second book was called Bodies That Matter, talking about the discourses of sex. So she understood that the bodies do matter, and this is discourse about. I mean, Judith Butler calls herself a feminist, and she wrote about Wittig's theories, misrepresenting some of them. But I saw queer theory as a offshoot of feminism. Feminism is for the interest of women, and framing the patriarchy from that vantage point, I think my interpretation of queer theory was it was looking at that same problem, but through the lens of homosexuality. And so I very much embraced aspects of that and very much identified with Halberstam's work to improve the profile of masculine women. And so that was all well and good. And but the problem is that we do still live in a world with gender. We do still live in a world with homophobia. And so as much as I found some of those theories helpful for my own internal self-concept, I was still experiencing quite severe homophobia. I mean, even into the early 90s, it wasn't uncommon for us, and as butch lesbians, we're very visibly lesbian. We wear that on our sleeve at all times. And so my partner and I lost housing opportunities, and they flat out told us it was because we were lesbians. And I lost a job the day after being outed as a lesbian. And when my partner was in a serious horseback riding accident and had brain injury, she was rushed to the hospital. And this was a long-term relationship. I think we'd been together for about 5 years at that point, and the hospital wouldn't give me any information about her because they didn't recognize me as next of kin.
Mm, I
And
can
then in
see that. Yeah.
2000, yeah, and then in 2003, one of my neighbors, a gay man, was murdered in a very vicious homophobic attack. I think it was 3 young men from the suburbs came into the city with the intent of finding a gay man and beating him, and they beat him to death in one of our parks. So there were things going on in my life at the time that were devastating and destabilizing. And in the midst of all of that, I saw a documentary on TV called, I think it was called Trans Kids. It was interviewing kids who had an incongruence very similar to my own, and framing that as if you experience that, that means you are a trans person. And that was, for me, the beginnings of a split between recognizing our incongruence as an aspect of our sexual orientation to conceptualizing that as a completely separate type of personhood. And they convinced me. I mean, it was mainstream television, a very well-produced documentary. And given everything that I was experiencing in my life at the time, I think made me more vulnerable to just accepting those ideas wholesale. And so instead of thinking of myself as I'm a lesbian and this is a lesbian experience, I started to see myself as, well, I must be incorrect, that I must be a trans person.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
And my girlfriend at the time, she watched that documentary with me. And when I said, well, that's me, they're talking about my experience. And she just kind of turned to me and said, well, I know. And she was best friends with a social worker at our local gender clinic and got me an appointment, and I was medicalized quite quickly. And yeah, so I've lived my life as a trans man ever since, and was just getting on with my life. And I wasn't seeing it as a problem, but now that I'm unpacking a lot of it, it's I do believe in an adult's bodily autonomy. I do think some people benefit from this intervention, but I think we need to dig deeper into why. What is that experience? What is the motivation, and why is it helpful? And we make these decisions in the world as it exists, but I think where we can find common ground with multiple other stakeholders in the conversation is that maybe the world shouldn't exist as it did, right? Maybe we shouldn't have experienced such violence and hostility from society for being highly gender nonconforming lesbians.
I'm kind of on board with that, honestly. So thank you again for sharing all of that. I guess I'll give you a little bit about myself so we can kind of, see the similarities. Like I said earlier, I was in a very similar boat. Like I was Catholic, homeschooled. I was very sheltered from the outside world. So this entire idea that you can just catch transness from like the internet doesn't really make sense to me because that hasn't been my experience. I was like girly like in earlier years. Um, I could probably make up some reason for why, but quite frankly, I liked the dresses that my grandmother made for me, so I enjoyed wearing them as a kid. My parents didn't have like a very strict the how do I put it? They wouldn't get mad at me for being tomboyish, but there was a very heavy implication of like, okay, well, you have to grow out of it eventually. And then when I didn't, that is kind of when the hostility started a bit more. Apparently, there was a rumor going on at my church when I was a teenager that I was a lesbian because of the way I looked and the way I dressed. And it's interesting that you mentioned the hostility that you got as a lesbian because I think that I definitely had some experiences where the way that I looked put people off or caused them to react to me differently than they would, like, I guess, a regular woman, if you want to call it that. But I think I might be like on some kind of spectrum of something. I know I have ADHD. I haven't really gotten a diagnosis for autism. The last time I tried, they I'm pretty sure they misdiagnosed me because at the time I hadn't transitioned yet, and it seems like my symptoms have changed, like that. Like they initially wanted to call me BPD, and then it's very interesting. I started taking testosterone, and then all the BPD symptoms kind of started to look more like male pattern autism. Like, kind of, I'm not male, obviously, so there's still some variance, but it did kind of change. Um, and so, like, I am in a similar boat of like looking back at my past now and kind of trying to unpack everything. I've only been on testosterone like almost 3 years now, so not nearly as long as you, but I did not have like the understanding of myself as like a lesbian as well as you did, I think. And so my sexual patterns and my interests in how I pursued those with like partners and stuff back then was, I think, like probably not as structured, or at least like probably not as functional as what you ended up finding for yourself, because uh, um and I think I don't I guess like one good way to put it is I probably haven't even gotten over a lot of the internalized homophobia yet. So I have like the trans thing on top of all that now. Is it definitely is like it's taking me a lot longer, I think, than I expected to kind of work through everything from the past and kind of like come to grips with all of that. I agree with you that like the it's definitely more complex than just like the autosexuality or the homosexual transsexual kind of distinction that I guess people like Blanchard have made. I think that if anything, the best bet is that that kind of typology will probably work better for males than for females, because it's a primarily sexually driven like delineation, whereas I don't think females are typically driven by sexual like gratification to do transition the way that a lot of us end up doing. Um, Sorry, I'm a little bit scattered. I'm trying to stay a little bit on topic here. Um, I think it's very interesting to me. So, do you feel like there was more representation of anti-queer like sentiment when it comes to being homophobic towards men versus lesbians? Do you think there was like more attention put on one side of the struggle, or do you feel like that was like pretty equally represented back then? Because I have no knowledge of what being gay was like in the '90s. So
There's always been more representation of gay men. There are more gay men
okay,
than there are lesbians. So that's maybe a part of it,
probably.
but it's also patriarchy that men tend to get the attention more so when women are sidelined. So, and there's always been battles. I when I came out, gay and lesbian were still tied together. At that point, I mean, at one point, lesbians and gay men were separated in advocacy, and the L and the B joined forces. Um, Things changed with AIDS. It was lesbians that were largely caretakers of gay men through the AIDS crisis, and I think that did a lot to bridge the gap between gay men and lesbians. But we're different. We have different interests. I mean, men and women in general have different interests, and our sexualities aren't the same, and our cultures aren't the same. And then so when I came out, it was when most of our resource centers were still gay and lesbian resource centers. I remember when the B was added, and I mean, we've continued to add letters since then. But yeah, there wasn't a lot of representation for lesbians in popular media. I mean, growing up in a small isolated town, the only real contact I had with the outside world was through the media, through television and magazines. We didn't have an internet yet, even.
Right.
I found the Gay and Lesbian Resource Center by looking it up in the phone book.
Mm.
Um, but the only representation I remember from the 80s and into the 90s, whenever there was a lesbian character in a movie, for example, she always ended up being a serial killer or something. Like,
Really?
representations were not positive.
That's crazy because that's what you hear trans women complain about nowadays. So it's so interesting that like it. Gosh, and maybe we'll get into this a little later. I really feel like sometimes it really feels like they hear what happens to lesbians and then they try and fit themselves into that same narrative. I don't. Maybe I'm completely making that up, but it seems so often like I hear later on I find out that lesbians have been saying something that is like considered new news in like the general queer spaces that I occupy nowadays. So it's really interesting. But sorry, continue. I just that's crazy.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I don't know what more I want to add to that. I mean, I certainly don't remember much representation of butch lesbians. So even when lesbians were represented, it was usually feminine lesbians, and yeah, weren't cast in a very positive light. So, one of the things that I found useful in feminist theory was things like Wittig's writing about how when we live in a world that has coded meaning for womanhood, that lesbians often feel alienated from that because we are gender nonconforming. We don't fit the definition of womanhood as given to us by society, and so we often feel othered, and we often feel. I think that's an aspect of that incongruence. Is if we're looking around at our peers and the adults in our lives, and we are so different from the other girls or women, that it's hard for us to construct meaning for ourselves, and meaning that through which we can develop some self-esteem. And so, it makes sense to me that we might think, well, then I'm not a woman. Like if I am this different from all of the other women, then am I that? So her famous quote was, "Lesbians are not women." And of course, what she meant wasn't the biological reality. Of course, she knew that lesbians were female, but we exist outside of the cultural framework of meaning for womanhood, and that is
sort of
very
a different use, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah. And because the framework of meaning is defined by heterosexuality, that the expectations for how men and women behave are defined on heterosexual terms. And so when we exist outside those boxes, I'm not trying to appeal to men. I'm not attracted to men, right? So men aren't the center of my life and don't inform, my identity and how I move through the world. So I think that's a very common lesbian experience, is when we exist without meaning, and that not having meaning can cause distress. And that's where I think feminism fell short, is that it articulated our lack of meaning, but didn't really go the next step in constructing meaning for us, and how do we fit within a social framework. And so I've lived through, at 52, I've lived through a number of social engineering projects for homosexuals. Society is organized, and there's disagreement about where we fit within that social fabric, and that is shifted time and time again. Every 10 to 20 years, that shifts. As political forces shift, political seasons change, and I think we're headed into a new political season. I think that's we're all feeling that there's now a culture war and disagreement about where we fit into the social fabric. And I think I don't think it's a coincidence that trans as a solution came about as there was a big movement to assimilate homosexuals on more heterosexual terms, that we can look and behave just like heterosexuals, we can get married just like heterosexuals, that we can fit into the social fabric by being kind of more palatable to heterosexuals, which put those of us that were gender nonconforming into a very difficult position, because it felt like our own community distanced itself from us and the gender nonconforming aspect of homosexuality. I think trans as a solution to that popped up at the same time as this big assimilation movement. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it split homosexuality into two, where there was our sexual orientation aspect, so the who we want to partner with aspect that became more mainstream and normalized, but that was split apart from the gender nonconforming dimension of homosexuality. Not all of us can just get rid of that. And
That's
so
a
we were channeled into this other solution. Well, if I transition, now I fit into the social fabric because I just look like a normal straight dude.
I think that that's a really interesting observation that I wasn't aware of. So I'm gonna look into that and see like because I want to know more for myself now. That's really interesting. Obviously like I was born in '98. My parents aren't even from America, so like that my knowledge of queer history before I was like really aware of my own like existence as like a gay person or trans or whatever. It like I have very little knowledge of that. I will say the reason I was asking about like representation and why a lot of what you just said was like really cool to hear was that I genuinely feel like if I had had better representation of like women who looked like me and outside of like Ruby Rose, I think that was the one woman that I saw back then who would dress like in a very butch way, and like she was the one where I first saw the idea of being able to like go from looking feminine to looking masculine, and when I saw that like that image of her, like it was kind of like a wake up call for me. I was like, oh wow, this is possible. You know, it's possible to be like a masculine woman and to like present yourself in that way. I thought it was really cool. And I think yeah, I think like a bunch of stuff that put me in a vulnerable position more than likely had something to do with me transitioning when I did. So I kind of understand where you're coming from on that. I feel like I was gonna say something about like the oh geez, don't let me lose it now. I'm sorry, I got very little sleep last night, so I'm like a little bit tired. But um, the assimilation point is that is really interesting to me. But I can see that. I can see the because you see it nowadays too, still with especially gays. I don't know if you're familiar with Brad Palumbo, but he is like his shtick is like the normal gay, and most of his content is about like ripping on TikTok SJWs or whatever, and it's like this very to me it's a very obvious grift. I don't think these people are very genuine at all. I think it's very much like, hey, look, I look very like traditionally masculine and male, and I'm gay, so please accept me, and I'll take the gender nonconforming people, throw them under the bus, type of thing. So yeah,
Well,
I
I mean, the problem
yeah,
now, trans activism, it's kind of making a mockery of gender nonconformity in a way that there's a backlash against gender nonconformity, and I think that's backwards, and it's something that the heterosexual men who transitioned, they transition because they may have been very typical heterosexual men at one point. They transition into gender nonconformity, right?
right.
Because I mean, especially if they're transitioning as adults, the effects of testosterone are permanent and irreversible, and that's a problem that they have, is that unless they happen to be very innately feminine as men, they don't tend to pass well as women. So they transition into gender nonconformity and experience that hostility perhaps for the first time, whereas the gender nonconforming homosexuals are transitioning out of gender nonconformity in order to blend in better.
Yep.
I think in both cases, the solution needs to be not just that we all pass better, but that we need to address this problem of gender nonconformity. It's not a moral failure to be a woman with short hair and wearing jeans, right? That's not a moral argument. There's no reason for why we should be treated with the hostility that we are. So I think that, I hope that the common project, regardless of what we've done with our own personal lives, existing in the world as it is, I think a future worthy of working towards is one in which gender nonconformity is acceptable.
I agree with that. I think it's also interesting that the backlash that I think masculine women usually get is at least in part, if not completely, uh, impacted by like the lack of ability to sexualize you if you're too masculine as a woman. This is like one of the first things that I kind of picked up on in the trans community. This is another funny note about like my entire feminist awakening, which has been embarrassingly late. Like I should have had this understanding of feminism way sooner. But one of the things that made it undeniable for me that misogyny and patriarchy were existed is because the only time I ever see trans men listened to in the community, especially online, is when they are still uh, capable of being sexualized. So if they still are able to present themselves as sex object, a lot of them have OnlyFans. They go with as a little amount of masculinity as possible, so that they can still have that appeal. And I can't really even blame them for that. I have no idea whether they would go more masculine or not if they didn't have that pressure to be appealing so that their voice can still be heard, you know? But I think the existence of that and the ignoring of anybody or any female to male person that doesn't really fit that category, you're basically marginalized to the point where you can only be a silent ally to trans women if you want any chance of being heard or taken seriously. And your gender is kind of like the affirming that they want you to do to them is kind of conditional on you being palatable to them. You know, so there's like an unequal balance there in how you're being treated, and it very much mimics how women are treated for being gender nonconforming. And so we really haven't solved the issue at all of gender nonconformity. All we've really helped, all that's really happened with the modern movement is that those who may have been like straight white men beforehand now have a little better understanding of what it's like to be gender nonconforming in the first place. And what's happened from that is that now we have this entirely um, male centric idea of passing, where it's like, you know, how much can you really define passing as looking like a woman or looking female or being an attractive female, right? There seems to be a difference there for a lot of trans women where being an average looking woman isn't enough. You have to be the porn model that you used to look at or whatever, right? So that we have this very, very strange like idea of what passing means, and that's now being used to influence children more so that they don't have to have that gender nonconforming experience were they to transition into women like later on, you know? So yeah, I agree. I think we've gone like kind of backwards, and I hate to say it. I hate to be the like oh, the males need to sit down and listen type of person. I normally don't like saying that kind of stuff, but especially when it comes to gender and queer theory and feminism, the fact that females are not being centered in that discussion, or the rights of females are not being centered in the discussion, when all of these things were kind of created. Well, I won't say queer theory as a whole, but feminism especially was created to prevent sex-based discrimination and to address that for females, you know? And we've kind of been sidelined within our own community. And even with the TERFs, you don't really get the it's almost like you have the trans community that wants to use us to affirm trans women and this like newer idea of transgenderism. I should say newer idea of transgenderism. I don't want to just you know, crap on all trans women. But on the TERF side, it feels like we're almost being used like we have to sacrifice ourselves or sacrifice our own little bit of comfort that we've been able to carve out for ourselves as trans people or as trans men, in order to uphold this like idea of feminism that they have. And it's like we need to be the ones that martyr ourselves now for a cause, where they have to face very few consequences for our decisions. You know, I was a very long rant, but I hope that made sense.
Well,
Like,
yeah, that makes total sense. You know, and it's just disappointing to see where queer theory has gone because it started as a champion for female masculinity. And the whole queer project dies as soon as we call ourselves men.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing revolutionary about a man being masculine.
Yeah. Yeah, and for us it's almost like there's no point in being like hyper masculine, I guess. We don't, and I just bluntly, we don't have penises. There's no point in being performatively hyper masculine. The only reason to present yourself in that way is because it symbolizes being able to dominate in some fashion. And that's just not the same for lesbians. Like it doesn't work that way. So hyper masculinity
Yeah.
just doesn't have the same meaning. Again, goes to passing, whereas like if you pursue hyper femininity, that's kind of like the only track to being a trans woman that there is. It's like you have to be hyper feminine as much as possible, or at least that's what a lot of them seem to internalize. You know, some of them, you know, people will go on different paths there, but there's you cannot hold that same stand. You cannot hold trans men to that same standard, or you know, female to males, whatever we end up calling them. But I agree. I think like being a woman and being able to recognize that womanhood is integral to like getting any rights at all, as who we are, for sure.
as trans men, it's we're in a difficult position for multiple reasons, but we're not in a great position to challenge the patriarchy because we're not threatening. I mean, men don't tend to feel threatened by us. We're smaller, usually gentler,
Yeah.
weaker, more pliable, agreeable men, right? So they don't really see us as competition. We're not going to dominate them in men's sports. I can't think of any trans men that are billionaires,
Yeah.
right? So we don't hold a lot of agency and social power.
Yeah.
So we've just kind of men tolerate us because it's like whatever, like 5 foot tall trans man, I don't feel threatened, right? So
Right.
but I think where we have more power and agency is accepting that sex is real and that we have been impacted by the patriarchy. We continue to be impacted by patriarchy, and more girls are taking this route to escape patriarchy.
Yeah.
And I think where a lot of trans people, I mean, a lot of trans people hate me. You know, those that are really invested in current narratives of trans activism feel very threatened by me. And I think I tried to understand them. I do have empathy as a person, even though I very much disagree with them. But I think where a lot of that fear comes from is the fear of societal's reaction to gender nonconformity. What else would be the fear? I mean, for me to say that I am female, which is absolutely a reality, for me to be open about that means that I am now a very, very highly gender nonconforming female. And I think that's the fear, is people know how society treats those of us that are gender not conforming. But the solution is to fight against that.
Yeah. I agree. And gosh, you said something that really was I wanted to respond to something you had just said. But no, I absolutely agree that like you really cannot transition yourself out of like the social role of like being a woman. That's kind of this something that you're like you're stuck with. I guess like my favorite example, obviously, I'm sure you've had a similar experience too. Being gender nonconforming, we do have like a different relationship with males in general. I think that a lot of us probably have more male friends than like a conforming female, or I guess a gender conforming woman. I know for myself, I've not felt the same like lack of safety around men that I hear a lot of women like cite. I've never really had that same fear towards them. I've always seen them as kind of like buddies more than anything. But I have noticed, as a result, I have had experiences where I feel like I've gotten to see how they interact with each other more up close. Um, and I think a great example of like how we're kind of confined to womanhood regardless is everything that men do is kind of gamified. A lot of our social systems, or even capitalism as a structure in general, it's all kind of based off of competition and winning, right? Almost everything that men do is this way. Even their recreational stuff, like video games and sports, are still about winning and gaining
Yes.
points and that kind of thing. Even trans women do this. Winning, passing becomes a game about winning, and whoever can pass the most, it's like that's you're the best one. Um, and trans men or women's spaces in general don't work that way. It's not so much about competition in the like general sense of like we don't bond with each other over competition. Our sense of reality isn't really based off of where we rank in context of a game, you know. And whereas a lot of men, I genuinely, I think a lot of the male mental health issues we talk about or hear about nowadays are because they're either lacking the right games or because they're losing at the ones they're being presented with, and it's causing them to have a very low negative view of themselves because hierarchically speaking they're all at the bottom, right? Now technically we're at the bottom as men, right? Because we have, but we also don't really see the point in engaging with competitions because of that, because we've never needed to compete with other men. We've never seen the point in that. So to your earlier point of like where do we kind of place ourselves in society, and how are we different from men and like conforming women, I think that's a really good example, is that we might look like men, we might present like men, depending on how well testosterone works for us, of course. But generally, we don't behave like men around other men, even, you know. And I think that's why they're probably not as threatened by us, is because we're not competing in the first place. There's no need to, you know.
Yeah.
Like,
Just to illustrate that point, there were things that would happen in my last relationship, because we were wed as a straight couple. My ex-wife was a very attractive woman and got a lot of male attention when she was out in public. So I would be out in public with her. The men would look me up and down, not see me as a threat, and hit on her right in front of me. Men would not do that in front of other men unless they saw them as, you're not competition for me.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great example, actually. Yeah, exactly. Because they if they feel like they can push their way around, they will, and it's so yeah. I mean, like as far as just like the fact that it spills over the competition aspect, it spills over into places where it shouldn't. You hear a lot about like the I think conservatives probably coined the term oppression Olympics, right? I think
Yeah.
that's just another example of like I think a competition being played out in a more progressive space, right? Where the amount of ability, your ability to cite active aggression against you, or active hostility against you as a member of society, or a marginalized member of society, is significant, or it symbolizes like a greater oppression that you face. And we often see oppression and like these forces of beyond our control that kind of marginalize everybody. We usually see them in the context of like aggression towards another person, like a homophobic attack or something like that, right? But there's a broader issue of being ignored completely. If you take like a completely different example, there's Native American reservations all over the United States where they're getting very little help of with anything they need, right? And nobody really knows about their plight or their issues or their problems because it doesn't get any representation. It doesn't get like talked about
Yeah.
enough, right?
Yeah.
And so I find that to be like a almost like a more insidious form of oppression. And I think women specifically face quite a bit, is because like if your problems do get represented, you don't have the guarantee that they're going to be represented fairly or accurately to best encompass all women's needs. And if you and at the and that's at the very best. At the very worst, you don't get represented at all. And seems like with gender nonconformity and trans men, even in the trans community now, we're facing that like competitive aspect of being heard that usually wraps itself up in victim points or whatever. And because we're not as sympathetic looking, because we're more masculine, because we don't have that sex appeal that we used to, it's like it's almost impossible to like kind of break through to people because we have really nothing to offer. We're not it's not profitable to talk about us in the news or anything.
Yeah.
You can't really get sensational clicks off of headlines about trans men the same way you can about trans women. I guess, again, my opinion, I could be wrong about that.
Yeah.
And then like on top of that, yeah, we have nothing else really to offer anymore because all people really cared about was our bodies in the first place, you know?
Yeah. And that's what I hope that trans men will come to understand, is that our agency is in the truth of the fact that we are the women in the conversation.
Absolutely.
It just is. It just is, right? We're sidelined. I mean, this whole idea of misogyny gets used against us because as soon as we have a voice and are assertive in our voice, we're just told, well, you're just being a misogynist man.
Yes. Yes.
And so or trans misogyny, you know, and anytime we criticize a trans woman, it's trans misogyny. So the only way around that is saying, well, no, I am the woman in the conversation. I grew up as a girl. I was socialized as a girl. I was somebody's daughter and mother and wife. So
they hate that because it invalidates their notion of womanhood.
It does, but we're in a trap otherwise as trans men.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not disagreeing, just saying that the backlash to that, yeah. But,
yeah. What was I going to say? There was another point I wanted to make. Yeah, what I wanted to go back to what you were saying about how men compete with one another and in ways that women don't. I agree with that, but certainly not to paint female to female dynamics as always
right.
warm and fuzzy either, right? There was a passage in Judith Halberstam's book about how butch lesbians are often treated in women's bathrooms.
Yes.
Women participate in the patriarchy too and enforce gender roles upon other women. And that is very clear in public bathrooms. those spaces that are for, sex segregated, that's where the most policing happens amongst women. And I thought she made a really good point that in this one written scenario about how the women were questioning whether this butch lesbian was in fact a man and saying, well, maybe we should call security. And the point was made that if the women truly believed that this was a man entering the bathroom, they probably wouldn't have toyed with her in the same way. That women's aggression towards other women is psychological warfare, whereas men are far more likely to be physically aggressive. Women tend to be more psychologically aggressive. And so the way that they were toying with this butch lesbian by dangling threats above her and maybe we should call security and maybe the cattiness of it illustrated that they knew damn well that that was a woman, but didn't fit into the gender stereotypes they found acceptable. And it's one of the ways that women enforce gender and patriarchy onto other women.
Absolutely, 100% agree. And yeah, I definitely was not trying to imply that things are friendlier on the women's side, but to your point, yes, they do participate in that like patriarchal structure in a different way, and it does happen. I've been lucky, like even before like transition or whatever, I've never had that kind of singled out behavior. Um, but I do know that like my lack of ability to connect with other women when I was a kid or other girls in my social circle, which again, remember, is very small because I was already homeschooled. So like not being able to fit in a group with other homeschoolers is like quite it's quite rough. It's like quite embarrassing. But like the other girls, like it would bother me too because they would call themselves tomboys and stuff, and I was like, I don't think you have any conception of what that means. You just like throwing the football around and talking to the guys. It's like I don't think we're the same thing. But the if they're not singling you out like that, I feel like it's often just they completely ignore you. Like they'll ostracize you, they'll avoid you. If you're like weird or you're yeah, if you're too weird for other women, yeah, they do kind of just they'll pick on
Yeah.
you in a different way.
Yeah.
It's
That might
unfortunate.
be a good segue because we're talking about dynamics between women. That might be a good segue into some of the
Yes,
points that you made in your article, which I thought was really good.
too.
And I think one of the central points is that you don't want to really publicly unpack any of the trauma you've experienced, even if maybe it had been a factor in your transition, because we do that in a very politicized environment when we speak publicly, and that the radical feminists tend to exploit any of our traumas. And I think that's true. I don't think they're going to like that pushback very much, but I think it's true that they regard us as traumatized, broken women that have abandoned our womanhood, and they prey upon that, and they exploit that for political purposes in ways that I don't think that they would exploit a feminine presenting woman who's experienced trauma.
No, no, absolutely not. And yeah, to expand on that, like I don't think I touched on this so as much in the article, but I really do believe that a lot of this politicization, especially on like in online environments, is because you can profit off of it now. You can your words and your ideas are a job now. If you're able to say what enough people want to hear, you can just make money off of that, and you don't really need to have logic or facts or anything really on your side. And I think that's the problem with the TERF and trans community for the most part is that they there's a lack of knowledge around, especially us as like gender nonconforming women. Um, there's a large lack of knowledge or research or data about us at all, and there's zero incentive to find answers because any answer that you find is very likely going to contradict at least one narrative out there right now. So if it comes out that like sexual trauma isn't actually that much of an influence on like a trans person's or trans man's transition, which I doubt. I'm sure it does have an influence, but let's just say hypothetically it doesn't. TERFs will not want to know about that. They would not want to acknowledge that fact because it would fly in the face of a lot of what they stand for. The same way we were saying earlier, how like there's a lot of reticence against us being the women in the conversation or being the females in the conversation because of what it invalidates them and what it contradicts on the trans side of the narrative. You know, like we're trapped. Like it's unfortunately, like I hate to say capitalism's fault, but it kind of is, because it is an environment where it's solely driven by money making, and it's causing this exploitation of severe trauma. I was in some kind of Twitter space with some gender critical people, and I this was like a few days ago, and I just briefly mentioned, I was like, you know, the exact thing that I was describing in the article kind of happened in real time. I said, like, yeah, you know, like transitioning has been great for me. Like I haven't regretted it so far. I do acknowledge biological reality and all that, but for some reason testosterone has helped me. And I want to know why. I want to know why that's been such a helpful experience for me. And it was either like they wanted more details about how it helped me. So now I have to divulge like personal information. So it's helped you process things better. What kind of things has it helped you process? So now you have to divulge more information about yourself, and it's all done with the intention of picking it apart and then dismissing it so that they can like kind of just hand wave it away. It's never done with the intention of actually engaging with you as a human being. It's you're a book for them to be able to analyze and pick apart and then disregard. Which yeah, I find that just very,
and
very insidious.
they'll weaponize those vulnerabilities, right? They
Yes.
see us, they don't, as much as they scream, you're a woman, you're a woman, you're a woman at us, they don't treat us like women,
No, and
right?
then if you say, well, I am a woman, but I would prefer to stay on testosterone, now that's a problem as well, because like you were saying, it's the gender nonconformity aspect that a lot of them have an issue with. So yeah, again, not to cut you off, but yeah, that's something else that really bothers me, is just like what is wrong with being a woman on testosterone? What's wrong with being a man on estrogen if you wanted to be that, right? Like I don't see the problem with that, as long as it's not causing like extra health issues, or if it's not being a burden on your life or hurting you in any way. I don't see the problem with inducing more gender nonconformity if that like helps you live a better life, you know. Um, so yeah, I definitely think that there's an exploitation, and none of these people are psychologists. None of these people know how to handle a traumatized person. Let's say there
Yeah.
is like severe trauma in a trans man, and now you want to pick it apart with zero understanding of how trauma works. There's therapists who get licenses in like therapies to help people process this trauma. You can't just rip it open and start picking apart in vulnerable people's like sensitive memories, and then take credit for the emotional breakdown you might cause, and then use that to further them, like, or to further push them into like detransitioning or doing what you want. You know, that's just such a psychologically abusive like dynamic. If that were me and like a guy in a relationship, everybody would say leave him. You know, like,
Yeah.
so it's
Yeah,
just yeah,
I agree with you. And I mean, that's a challenge, a difficulty that I've experienced because I have been so publicly transparent with my story. Um, and yeah, absolutely, people take notes and exploit anything that they can about that story. You know, when we're unpacking, thing is, I guess where I felt somewhat okay doing that is that I've already worked through a lot of that trauma, so I'm not bringing it from a place of trauma. I'm bringing it from a place of having already come out the other side of it. Otherwise, it would have been devastating. But I would really caution people about doing that. The thing about activism or the general public is they're not limited by the confines of therapeutic ethical practice.
yeah,
Activists are just trying to win.
yeah.
And so I think it's really important. I think it's important that we do dig deep into our experiences and really understand them so that we can begin to imagine a future where things are better for people like us. But that needs to be done within the confines of ethics in therapeutic practice, not people that are just motivated by winning a political argument and using whatever they can as weapons.
Exactly. And I mean, like, specifically with women, like the medical discrimination, the I'm sure you probably know more about this than I do as a nurse, is like I've heard from my sister and from other women in my life that like you will just get brushed off if they don't know how to help you. I know people who've had like they've suffered with endometriosis, or they've been in like like dealing with chronic pain for a very long time, and doctors just say there's nothing wrong with you, there's nothing wrong with you, until they finally have the money or the insurance to go to a specialist, and then they find out there's this like plethora of problems that like have gone unnoticed because nobody knew how to help them. So like on top of that, when you're talking about women and trauma, and like now you're adding an aspect of gender nonconformity on top of that, it becomes difficult to even find or to conceptualize a medical professional that has done the work to get rid of all their other biases, where they can actually help you without injecting their own perspective or their own beliefs into your life. You know,
Yeah.
it's one reason I've held off on finding a therapist for so long. Like I got rid of my last one because the relationship was just getting very unhealthy, and I haven't really felt comfortable finding another person because I don't want to go through the whole process of opening up again and then having that same issue of like somebody not handling that with the care that I feel like it needs, you know?
Unfortunately, there are activist therapists too, right? That are
Yeah.
from either side of the aisle that want to impose their own political narratives onto us, which interferes with good therapy.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's yeah, it puts us in a very like difficult situation. It's like it's a bind where no matter which direction you want to go in, there really is no current space for people to like openly discuss like these kinds of things. I think Aaron Kimberly and Tally from the Naval Gaze podcast, they've done a pretty good job. I see their podcast about like AAP, and they're kind of discussing the like sexuality aspect of AGP and the autoandrophilia side of things as well. So I think that kind of stuff is pretty cool. But so far as like a kind of collective group where we can all kind of discuss these things on our terms, is it's like it really does not exist that
Just
that well.
just a quick correction, Aaron Terrell, not Aaron Kimberly.
Oh my gosh, that's you. I am
Sure.
so sorry.
That's okay. No, I just
Yeah.
to not confuse listeners, I just wanted to.
Right. Yeah, it's Aaron Terrell and Tally, not Aaron Kimberly. Aaron
Aaron
Kimberly is the guy
Terrell.
we're talking to right now. So,
Yeah.
sorry. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of ways that I think feminism can be helpful for us. And one of the curiosities that I had at the onset was, because a lot of feminist theory, certainly in fact, second wave feminism, asserts that the root of our oppression is in our biology. It's because of some of the limitations of our biology, like the fact that we can get pregnant and that we're smaller and weaker. That our oppression is inseparable from our biological reality. So I was really curious, like, if that's true, does that still apply to trans men who pass in the world as men? And what I found really interesting when I actually started looking at data, and I was able to parse out, okay, who are the men and who are the women, like biologically speaking, in this data, that all of those domains of feminism, things like reproductive rights and poverty and sexual violence, and so all of those domains that feminism point to as women's oppression under patriarchy, what I found is in the data is that it still applies to trans men in all of those domains. We're still more likely to experience poverty. We're still more likely to be sexually assaulted. We're still sidelined in the conversation. Like, so I found that really interesting and affirming of feminism, that because we are still female, even though we pass as men, that sex-based oppression still applies to us in all of those domains.
Yeah.
And as far as interacting with other feminists, I mean, they know damn well that we're women. We don't need their permission to embrace feminism and to work on the feminist project. It's ours as much as it is theirs. We are female. We still experience all those patterns of sex-based oppression. And we can speak into it. And as women, we've made a choice that they may not like, but we are still female. We are still women. Feminism still applies to us. We still deserve dignity and agency.
Yes. And I think that, like, quite honestly, I think asserting ourselves in like feminist spaces is probably going to be more effective in getting us heard and kind of establishing ourselves, rather than trying to appeal to the trans community or to the broader realm of society, with because we kind of need the feminist community to have our back if we want to make it anywhere, you know. So it's like appealing to that and starting there, I think, is the best like foot forward, which is why I think your website is awesome. The stuff that you kind of talk about is like really, really great. We need more of that because it kind of keeps people. It reminds people that we're out there and that we do exist and that we do have like things to say about this. Um, I think that I think my best understanding of like that common through line of sex based oppression that trans men and women face. Um, I think it's interesting because kind of going back to the like game thing earlier. If how do I put it? Because sorry, let me backtrack a little bit. When I was growing up, when I heard about feminism and when I understood what I understood feminism to be was loud, angry, bitter women who, wanted to kill their babies with abortion. That was kind of like being conservative and everything. Like being a feminist was like I was instilled with a fear of being seen as a feminist or being a feminist before I even understood what that meant. I would listen. My parents would listen to people like Rush Limbaugh or Mark Levin. These like really bombastic radio hosts that had absolutely, all they wanted to do was be offensive and speak their truth or whatever. And it severely impacted my ability to like engage with like feminism or anything. And then the bad representation that feminism's gotten on top of that gave me an even worse impression. So it kind of almost confirmed everything that I had learned about it from conservatives as a kid. This I and it perpetuated this image in my mind of what patriarchy and misogyny kind of was. And it was that feminists genuinely believe that there's like a room full of white guys out there somewhere, like rubbing their hands together, trying to find ways to like bully women. And that's kind of like the impression I had for the longest time, which is obviously it's like total bullshit. It makes no sense. And it quite literally was just like emotionally feeding a bias that I didn't even know I had. Then like learning about it now, and especially like kind of I may end up writing more about like this like idea of games and males and all that because I think is really important is that when if you're focused on winning as a guy and that's kind of like your main mode of operation like through life is you're focused on winning games, you're not going to give a single shit about like the women in your life or anybody who's different from you. You're either competition or you're something to be competed over, like you're either an object to acquire or you're a competitor. And it seems like that's kind of it's not so much that they hate you or they hate women, and I don't really like framing it in that way all the time. Maybe that's my own me being naive, but I don't like that framing because usually it's just they're ignoring you, and then when you annoy them, then they hate you. Like, and so it's like at least for me, that's how I've seen it. And so it's the same kind of thing with trans men where they want to ignore you because they have their goals, they have what they want to achieve, and if you get in the way of that, now you're the enemy, and now you're too annoying, and now you have to be kind of taken care of. I think, and there's this, it's again, it's that implicit like ignoring of your problems and the marginalizing through just not looking that I think causes a lot of the problems for women, period. But especially for trans men, where now you don't even have the women who are all on board because they have their own games they want to win through feminism and through the narratives that they want to push, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
It's important to understand that the patriarchy isn't about individual men and individual women. We're not all women are equally oppressed, and that's a problem I have with identity politics these days. Is it puts us all into these identity boxes, in which it's presumed that we're all equally disadvantaged within those boxes. So it's not that all women are disadvantaged in the same way and have all the same experiences, and that men are all women haters. Like, patriarchy is something that is embedded into systems, and that we all, to greater or lesser extents, participate in those systems. That's the difference between radical feminism and other forms of feminism. Is radical feminism is looking at the roots and see this as embedded into our systems. Now, that's going to be true in some cultures more than others. It's perhaps less true in North America than it would be in Iran, for example. But
right.
So we got to be careful. Like, we're looking at things at a population level, as I was doing when I was looking at stats about trans men, that on average we tend to experience more poverty, sexual assault, intimate partner violence. But that doesn't mean that applies to every single individual trans man, right? So we're looking at things from a population basis and seeing women as disadvantaged over and over and over again, but that doesn't mean each individual woman is disadvantaged and each individual man is trying to cause that disadvantage.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think that's going to be pretty important to like I hate to say clarify because it really should be obvious, but I really feel like a lot of the bad press that's kind of come around from feminism. I don't know, like the 2016 era of like the BuzzFeed videos and stuff. That's what influenced me a lot. Like back then, I saw it influence a lot of people. That's sort of like Gamergate type stuff. I think that sometimes it gets overstated how serious that entire thing was because it was primarily an internet thing. But I do see like the impact that's had on just like people's impressions of progressive politics in general is that it's very very negatively slanted based off of assumptions they've made about it because those ideas got really badly represented to them initially. So yeah, I 100% agree. It's like patriarchy is absolutely like it's more embedded in the system than it is like individual people. And I think that like um, the more people that like are able to kind of reiterate that so that people with like short attention spans remember it. I think that can be helpful because it seems like a lot of people are under a different impression of what like people are talking about when they even bring up feminism or patriarchy or any of these things. But
And both men and women, I think, by being put into boxes. So gender is understood as a device of patriarchy. That's one of the ways that it enforces patriarchy is by putting us into boxes and having expectations. Both men and women are impacted by being put into boxes. Like none of us are allowed to be truly free in ourselves if we're just sort of playing out a role in society. And I do hear men express that. I mean, they're not versed in feminist theory and they don't know what words to use. But yeah, I've heard men, because they open up to me, they see me as another dude. They open up to me in a way that they probably wouldn't open up to a woman. And
yes,
a lot of them do have this sort of low grade depression where they feel like I'm just going through the motions of, playing out a role, especially in with their wives, like, or in the workplace, that they always feel like they just have to play a role. They have to be in competition with men. They have to be, a certain provider, protector, the rock for their wives. And so everyone is kind of going through the motions of this thing called gender in ways that we all sacrifice an aspect of ourselves.
yes, absolutely. I've seen it as well. And the my partner is male. He was actually like pretty gender nonconforming as a kid in high school, and I don't think he minds me telling about this because I've talked about it before. But um, he was picked on and harassed, very similar to like the way women are often harassed because of that, because he looked more feminine than like other guys, and so it's there is absolutely like we have to keep that in mind as well for sure that like there is an impact on men because of like the patriarchal structures and it's not serving them well either. I think it is probably causing like a lot of their a lot of the like mental health problems and it's just we haven't found a way to kind of figure out the language to communicate that in a way where it kind of clicks and people resonate with it. I think like unfortunately there are people like on the far right that are starting to like resonate with men for some good reasons and probably some bad reasons as well. Like definitely some bad reasons as well. But I think that we have yet on the progressive side to find a way to fully break through and find a connection there.
Yeah, I'm concerned that the backlash that we've caused by the extremism on the left is gonna create an overcorrection by the right, which concerns me.
Yeah.
There is a lot more blatant homophobia out there that they probably always felt, but it wasn't socially fashionable to say it out loud, and it's being said out loud a lot more these days.
Yes.
A crackdown on homosexuality, a crackdown on feminism, a crackdown on gender nonconformity, which is the opposite of the direction we should be going in,
Yeah.
especially for the girls, given that girls are now 70% of those showing up to clinics. I mean,
Yeah. I was going to ask
promoting
about that.
yeah, promoting gender nonconformity and improving the quality of life for girls is obviously necessary.
Yeah. And I mean, like improving the quality of life for girls, I think is like if we were to prioritize that in a pragmatic way, instead of just turning it into like, because I feel like a lot of people will they'll say they care about young girls. They say they want to help them and everything, and it's very much just for virtue signal. They don't really do a whole lot to actually analyze that outside of their own interests. Um, and I think like it's a net negative because you do want an environment where girls can experience nonconformity and they have more kind of options available to them, without feeling like transitioning may be the only way they can feel any kind of assimilation or feel like they fit in at all. I know this wasn't even that long ago. I was talking to my mother, um, and I've had the I've had a very like consistent experience with like a certain type of loneliness, which Jack Halberstrom was the only person I've ever seen articulate that in a way where I was like, holy I didn't know this was something other people felt. Specifically because you're female and because you're othered and being gender nonconforming on top of that. That was one of the first moments I had of like, oh my gosh, I think maybe there are other people actually out there like me who have had these like same experiences or whatnot. But I think that the loneliness aspect is something that is not discussed at all, especially when it comes to girls and nonconformity. And it is just becoming more difficult for everybody to conform. The standards have gotten so high. You've got
Yeah.
like TikTok now that's throwing even more sexual imagery in everybody's faces, and it's really bad. Like it's not good for girls to be seeing this stuff, and neither is it good for boys.
Yeah. People
Um,
don't always know how to interact with us when we're highly gender not conforming. Like men have their own internal sort of men to men culture, as do women. And when we're gender not conforming, we don't fit within those systems very well. So the men kind of test us and in some ways try to compete with us in ways that it's difficult for us to compete. Like we're not as big and strong as they are. So we don't really fit into male culture in a way that is actually fair to us, but we don't fit within a lot of the female typical bonding rituals either.
yeah,
Like I remember going to sleepovers with the girls and they wanted to do each other's hair and makeup and put nail polish on each other. It's like I want to bond with them, but I'm just not interested in those kinds of things, right? So
right.
it is lonely. It is lonely because you don't really fit in with the boys or the girls.
Exactly. And I think puberty is very distressing for that reason, is because it at least for me, I was reflecting on this not too long ago. Like puberty, before puberty hit, I was actually okay. Wearing dresses didn't really matter if you were wearing pants or a dress. It's you're all kind of the same thing until puberty hits, and that's when the differences become very very apparent. And I think that especially for girls who not even counting neurodivergency or anything, um, if you're used to being around boys and you're used to being their friends before puberty, then puberty hits and things all change. I feel like I just didn't catch the memo. Like, quite honestly, I think that for me, it took me a very long time to realize like our bodies have changed now. You're not going to be seen the same way as you were when you were a kid. Like that has changed now. It's over. And it seems
Yeah.
I don't know if like that's where I can't tell if like spectrum is involved or if that's just like a more common experience outside of being neurodivergent that people might have, where it's just like they don't really register the fact that well puberty changes you and you can't really go back now. And it's not so much with trans women, they'll often say like the physical changes to their body are very distressing. I don't know if that's always the case for us. I know some of my sex characteristics were distressing, but others, it was kind of just like, well, I'm not as strong as the boys now. I can't compete with them anymore. I can't keep up with them physically or even like on basis of stamina. And that was a huge hit to my self image, was the fact that I couldn't keep up. I could not keep up with guys anymore, and the idea that I was different because my I was female and not male didn't seem to really like click for me. It was just like I had one experience where some guy was talking about how many hours he had worked in a week, and it was like some crazy number. Now he might have been exaggerating. I can't tell now. But I remember feel like kind of hating myself because I was like I could never work that much. Like I don't have the physical stamina to do that. And I remember that like made me feel like total crap about myself because I was just like again, yeah, I was measuring myself to a standard that was like impossible for me to meet because I wasn't male. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think the loneliness like aspect of that it can be really tough for females. And I wouldn't be surprised if that has something to do with the desire to transition, and I wouldn't blame them for that either.
Well, it's almost like halting our development in a sense. Like it's because you're right. Puberty for a lot of us is a very pivotal moment where all the rules change socially, and because before puberty, I got along with most of the kids, so, boys and girls. It just didn't matter, right? I didn't think about sex or gender. It just didn't matter. But when puberty hits, it does matter. And so I wonder to what extent, is the desire to suppress puberty and to medicalize as teens is almost about, I want to stay in that social arrangement that we had before puberty hit,
Yeah,
which
exactly.
is a societal problem. It's not a bodily problem, right?
No.
It's a social problem.
It is. It is. And I mean, I was gender nonconforming. I remember being 10 years old and I got my first like really short haircut and I looked like a boy and I loved it and I was really proud of it. And I remember kids being like, "Wait, you're a girl?" Like I remember one guy was like, "You're a girl. Wait, you're ugly for a girl," you know? And I laughed. I thought it was funny. I thought it was amusing. I had some kid ask me why I was wearing girl shoes once because the rest of me looked like just male. That was the beauty of being gender nonconforming before puberty hit, is that like you could just do whatever you wanted and kids couldn't tell. It was
Yeah.
awesome. And then that changes, and I think that can, yeah, it can be really really tough. But I think again, like people will hear that and they'll be like, oh, you're a victim, you. So if you're transitioning now, it's like it's proof that you're still a victim of this like dynamic, and it's like, well, I can't help this dynamic. This is what I was born into, and if this helps me in any way, even for the time being, then I don't agree with taking that away, even
Yeah,
if I stop it later on.
I don't understand why it is that with other types of victimization, like women that have been sexually assaulted, there's been a movement away from calling her a victim and calling her a survivor. I don't understand why that doesn't apply to us. Yes, in some ways we have been harmed by society, and it's that's true, but it does psychological damage to go through life feeling like a victim. Like, why are we not regarded as survivors?
Yeah, yeah, and to have like any sense of control that you have over that victimization be advocated against. If I don't know if transitioning is like is for everybody, or even for me, like a way of having control over like your own victimization. I don't know that. I would want to think about that a bit more. But saying it like just to to consider it like as a hypothetical, like why should it be up to us to give that up? If that's what helps us, why should it be on us? Why shouldn't we? Why is the focus on taking that away from us instead of changing society so that there's less of us in the future? If it really is such a painful and traumatic thing for us to go through, why are we? Why is everyone focused on attacking us instead of attacking the system that kind of like caused us to turn out this way? I
Exactly,
will always say,
exactly.
like, if you want less people like me, have less conservative parents who are absolutely clueless on how to raise girls. Like that would be my first thing, is probably have parents that are more supportive of gender nonconformity in young girls. That's probably the easiest way to get rid of a lot of these problems. But people don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that, hey, a lot of the things you support actually create more people like me, not less. So it's like,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think of us as a product of a time and place, and that time and place isn't our fault.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think we can still be agents of change for future generations, right? To make gender nonconformity more acceptable, and so that girls like us don't feel like they have to take that step. And demonizing us for having made this decision isn't helpful. Like, I don't understand, and it's not necessary to advocate for future generations of girls.
Yeah. So let me ask you then, because when you started, like at the beginning of this conversation, you were kind of talking about your experience in clinics and seeing the amount of like trans identified people coming in. Um, do you believe that like I know, I don't know if you're familiar with Prisha, I think her name is. She was a pretty outspoken detransitioner. I think the strongest position I've heard from her is that she wants to ban gender affirming care for everyone under 25, I believe. Now that's like, I guess that's like a bit extreme to me, but how do you feel with like what you've experienced in clinics, and as somebody who's been in the medical field, where do you think like the line kind of is on gender medicine, or where do you think it should be?
It's a challenging question. I mean, the difference between a girl and a woman is kind of arbitrary, right? I mean, our society has sort of arbitrarily drawn a line at 18 or 21, and it's, it's different from place to place. But one of the things that concerns me about this current generation of 20-year-olds is that COVID had a huge impact on their social psychological development. They were isolated from their peers at a very crucial time in their development where developing peer relationships was critically important. It isolated them all from one another and drove them online, and they've picked up a lot of bad habits and bad ideas online. So most of those kids are developmentally delayed.
That's fair. That's fair. Huh. So
And
you
I think that needs to change where we draw the line for them, in order for them to actually be considered adults and consent, because the average 20-year-old is not what a 20-year-old was 10, 20 years ago. They're roughly 5 years behind in their development.
I agree. I think that my sister and I have joked about like being 30 is kind of like being 20, or what being 20 used to be. It feels like, and being 20 is kind of like you're in like your late teens now. And part of my theory for why that is, I didn't even think of COVID. That's a great point. I was even just thinking the we're dying so much older now than we used to. So I feel like maturity just kind of slows the longer like your lifespan you have. So I can see the argument for like being not like not outright banning, but being more restrictive with gender medicine. Absolutely. Just because, yeah, I mean, where people are at right now, whether due to COVID or other reasons, like it is absolutely going to have an impact on like people's development and how they're able to like understand these things. I think one of my strongest arguments against like gender medicine for kids is that you have to go through your first puberty before you even know who you are. Like I would have not been able to figure out if I was a boy or a girl like in puberty. In fact, one of the hardest things for me was I would look in the mirror and I had no idea what I was looking at, because I would be androgynous, or I would like cross dress sometimes, and it would actually be distressing just because like I didn't know what I was looking at in the first place. Like my ability to form an identity was like pretty disrupted, not just by like the social situation I was in, but also like my own family life that had its own problems and whatnot. So yeah, I mean, I think the ability to form any identity first, like before you even transition, has to happen before you can make the decision of your like what you want your identity to become, or what you want to become later down the line, for sure. And I think if you can make that argument for teens, you can definitely make that argument for some adults. Absolutely.
Trans is this one bizarre black hole where everything else we know about clinical practice goes out the window as soon as someone says they're trans, right? I mean, even as looking at just basic developmental psychology, we know that teens tend to be reckless, that they can't imagine a future, that they take risks because they think they're invincible. They're very passionate and have tunnel vision. And it's a time where they're supposed to be figuring out their identities, and they're not yet written into stone. That sounds like a cluster of things that makes that the worst time possible to make permanent changes to your body.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when your ability to find your identity is already being restricted by other things in society, I mean, like school hours are way too long, in my opinion. Like kids are not getting the outlets that they need in order to actively pursue their interests outside of like what's provided to them by like school funding and whatnot, which isn't always great. Even for boys, like I think that talking about recreational games, it feels like they really only have sports and video games. They have really nothing outside of those two outlets, and video games are already showing to like be pretty damaging in certain aspects for mental health. So you really only have sports. So you have to fit like a certain role and a certain type of person to have access to any kind of recreational competition in the first place. And yeah, I mean, in general, it's like there's so many other things lacking that I could really see an argument for the entire wave of trans people that we've been seeing, that just it's all just like socially driven like issues from other parts of their life that we're all collectively being driven to this like the center of like what we hope is going to be like a relief. And obviously it doesn't always end up that way. um I guess I'm also curious, not to switch gears unless you wanted to add something to that. Um, when you were talking about being blacklisted for doing assessments, what was that kind of like? I'm curious now. Did you feel like they were trying to discourage you because it was hurting their profit, or was it like an ideological thing more? Like how was that?
My read is it's ideological.
Okay.
And, it surprised me because, I mean, I'd been out of the loop for 20 years. I hadn't been living within trans community. I wasn't involved in activism. So I was still thinking about things the way that I thought of them 20 years ago. And then just kind of, I wasn't trying to be an asshole. I just kind of walked in talking like this is just common sense, right? And, Jack Halberstam and female masculinity and different pathways to transition and assessment. And it's like, so what surprised me wasn't that, that someone politely said, well, we thought of it that way 20 years ago, but that, our thinking has evolved and blah, blah, blah. And this is how we think of things now. Instead, it was just this, you're a bigot.
Wow. Jeez.
You're a bigot, and this is not welcome conversation. I'm surprised this is even allowed on this listserv because it was a clinical listserv. And so just this immediate hostility. It's like, because they call all of this turf rhetoric now, right? I mean, any
Yeah.
conversation about biological sex or different pathways to transition, or they just call that all turf rhetoric. It's like, well, but we all thought of it this way 20 years ago too. Like,
Yeah. And
so
so much literature has been founded on like the differences between sex and stuff. It's like you can't just erase that and not and it if you were to take like a decade, you could not erase how the significance of like sex-based differences between males and females. Like you can't just get rid of that in one movement. So the fact that they would even try like points to their, I don't know, maybe lack of knowledge on any of this stuff. I wouldn't be surprised if you were probably the most knowledgeable person there on like the actual feminism aspect of any of this, because it seems like a lot of these people don't really know the history, from what you're telling me at least.
yeah, there were people on the listserv that did support me, but they wouldn't say so publicly. They just kind of slipped messages to me privately. But I
Wow.
mean, because that's just the climate that we're in right now, right? Is it's a cancellation culture that if you say anything that strays, you're immediately just your head gets lopped off.
It's
Um,
true.
so I mean, I was accused of being on the listserv just to kind of spy on them and promote turf propaganda, and our clinic ended up being boycotted, and I was moved to a different program within the organization.
Wow. Jeez. I'm sorry to hear that because I feel like you would have actually been really helpful in that field. you should have you should have
Well, I
stayed
mean,
there.
well, the backlash wasn't coming from our clients. I mean, I think most of the youth that I was working with appreciated having someone come alongside them and say, well, have you thought of this? Have you thought of this? Have you thought of this? Like, here's some actual information that might be helpful for you to understand yourself. And in my mind, that is a normal nursing role, is to help people navigate systems, to help them understand the nature of what they're experiencing so that they can be,
Yeah.
in a position of making sound decisions for themselves. If they're just indoctrinated into a way of thinking, that's not agency, right? That's just compliance.
And it's unfortunate. I agree, and it's unfortunate because the point I think shouldn't be to like eliminate the current options, but to expand on those options, to give people more options that they can explore before choosing like the most medicalized one possible. And the fact that that's the threat, like the fact that it doesn't seem like you were trying to discourage anybody, but you were trying to offer them like a broader perspective and more options to kind of like pursue before they go with like the literally taking testosterone and making permanent changes, or taking estrogen or making permanent changes,
Yeah.
and the fact that is the problem for people, that you're not even trying to shut down anything, you're just trying to offer people more availability. That's where I almost like I start to wonder how much ideology and profit incentive might be kind of interlinked, or like correlating in some way, because I can't see any other reason why people would be against that unless they were profiting off of the way things are currently. And ideology, I think, is like it's the way you can kind of rope stupid people into making money for you. I think it's like probably a good way to put it. Or I shouldn't say stupid, but like ignorant people, whatever. Because you know, take any media empire, even the medical industry, like how much ideology is pushed through there, and it always ends up funneling money back into the pockets of people way richer than any of us.
It's
Um,
such a bizarre state of affairs because, I mean, like I said, I wasn't a gender affirming care specialist. I worked in general mental health. I can't imagine. I mean, I'm used to a culture of nursing and working in other areas of practice where we attend conferences where we're allowed to debate ideas. Sometimes those conversations were heated, but it's a normal process within clinical practice and science to be able to freely debate evidence and how that evidence applies to your practice. And I mean, to be called a bigot for claiming that something exists when it exists, it's written into our current DSM. So the chapter on gender dysphoria outlines the two known pathways. It doesn't mean that there are only two pathways, but there are two known pathways, and that is in our current diagnostic manual. And I work in psychiatry. Why would I not defer to diagnostic manuals? I mean, yes, there are politics in how those things are written, but as a nurse, I have to work within how they're currently written.
yeah,
So it's just so bizarre, like to be told that this is propaganda when it's in our current diagnostic manual, and even in terms of the current. Now we have a new WPAS standards of care, but what I was saying fit within the previous standards of care, which stated explicitly, I think it was on page 8, and it's burned into my mind because it's important. Is they said psychotherapy can often be helpful to help people integrate their identities in a way that they may avoid lifelong medicalization. That's a paraphrase, but that's basically what they said. So it's not about saying to a gender nonconforming person that there's something wrong with your gender nonconformity, but can we help you? Like, what's going on in your life that's making that difficult?
yeah,
And can we help you integrate your gender nonconformity into a meaningful identity for yourself in which you feel satisfied and don't have to take a medical pathway? I think that's an important conversation to have. And even WPATH endorsed that can be
really,
helpful. For me, it's not about dictating people's identities. People are allowed to have ideas I don't agree with, or allowed to have identities I don't understand. But when we're talking about minors making permanent alterations to their bodies, when the current WPATH standards of care says psychotherapy can often be helpful, that's what I'm going with a minor. Before
exactly.
saying, without barely any assessment, saying, sure, like start amputating body parts and making irreversible changes. Like, to me, it's just common sense. In medicine, we always start with the least invasive interventions first before jumping to the most invasive intervention. And that isn't how people are practicing now. And it's alarming to me, especially when we're talking about kids.
And it's so strange. I really want to do more research and dig into that. I've seen I do have some turf friends who are more moderate. They're not outright hateful. And they've done some research kind of into the background of like gender medicine, and I want to talk to some of them because from what I've heard, they've found some interesting information. So I've I try not to get too uh I try not to go too hardcore on like conspiracy trains and stuff, but especially after my own experience in the last couple years of with like the medical system in America. Not just even for myself, but even for people around me who have had like awful experiences with doctors, medical professionals, anything. I am like getting pretty radicalized on like how these systems work and who they actually serve, and it's clearly
Yeah,
not us. And transgender medicine, I think, if anything, it can be a very good example of how the medical system in this country does not serve the patients. It serves the doctors and the pharmaceutical companies. And I don't think that I don't think that trans was invented to make pharmaceutical companies more money. But if pushing a certain type of transness or a certain type of trans ideology lines their pockets more, I don't see why they wouldn't propagandize that and push it to its fullest extent.
I
Um,
agree. Yeah, and even the way the standards of care is written, it's more protective of the clinicians from liability lawsuits than it is for protecting the patients.
exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I was planning, it was like last year, no, earlier this year, actually. I had been planning to do my hysterectomy, and I ended up canceling it because insurance told me last minute it was going to cost me my life savings. So I was like, well, I don't want to do that. But I'm glad I didn't. And it's gosh, I was going somewhere with that. I'm so sorry. The completely I'm sorry. But yeah, no, to your point, like the profit incentive is like pretty perverse. And I think that when it comes to these like huge changes, there's just no reason to encourage it right off the bat. I mean, even if I end up getting a hysterectomy, I think I'm way too early in my transition to make that decision. So it's another reason why I'm glad to I'm glad avoided that for the time being. But yeah, that was pretty crazy. But trying to see. You said the majority of trans youth didn't fit the typology that you were kind of or
Yeah.
the distinction of like homosexual and autosexual. What do you think your best assessment is for like that remainder that you've observed, like from everything you know and from everything you've kind of read and studied? Like, what do you think is going on that we haven't
Yeah.
discussed? I guess.
It used to be that most of the young people that were showing up to clinics who were highly gender nonconforming as kids and same sex attracted. So a lot of these girls that I saw, it was 70% girls, which is a ratio flip. It used to be mostly boys and men that were coming into clinics. And most of those girls were same-sex attracted, but very few of them had a history of being gender nonconforming. So that was the first thing I noticed, was they would often say, well, no, I've never had gender dysphoria and I wasn't gender nonconforming. And their parents would say, well, my daughter enjoyed wearing dresses and playing with dolls and was a very typical girl, but then has now adopted a trans identity. I think it's turned into a youth subculture, a political movement, and a way of thinking that I think is convincing more and more young people, especially girls, that there's a solution to their life problems through medicalization. And I think for some of them, it was about belonging to a peer group. I mean, some of them, like, with ADHD or autism, they really struggled socially. So puberty was extra hard for them. And I think they saw a lot of their more quirky friends, adopting trans identities. And there's this little community and subculture for them that they feel a sense of belonging in. And some of them, I think, when I asked them about their motivations, they said, well, all my friends are taking testosterone and I don't want to feel alienated from my friends group, and
Wow.
they're doing it and I want to do it too. And so it seemed to be very much about social belonging. And for others, it was about having a very overly limited view of what a girl can be. There was this one girl that she'd been coming to me for a while and wanting hormones, and her parents brought her in to see me one day and she was looking very distraught. So I brought her into my office and started talking to her and asked her, like, what's going on? And she said, well, I'm not happy. And I asked her, well, when were you last happy? And she said, when I was a girl.
Hmm.
But that seemed to be a problem for her, right? And so I said, so what is that problem then? Like, if you were happier as a girl, what is preventing you from just accepting that you're a girl? And she said, well, then I'd have to grow my hair long and I'd have to start wearing dresses and wearing pink and, listing all these feminine stereotypes. And I said, no, you don't. Like, girls are allowed to have short hair and you don't have to change a thing about you. I mean, at that time she had short hair and a baggy sweatshirt and
Yeah.
sweatpants and a pair of running shoes. And I said, you right there, sitting there as you are, is a perfectly acceptable way of being a girl. And I said, you've been spending all this time exploring all these gender categories. Has it occurred to you to just explore what kind of girl you are? And I could tell that had never even occurred to her, just by the look on her face. Like, it's almost like this light bulb went off and it's like, oh, well, that hadn't really occurred to me as an option.
Hmm.
I said, maybe you're just the kind of girl that likes having short hair and baggy clothes and running shoes. Like, so I said, why don't you make that your project for a while? Is just think about, if you were a girl, what kind of girl are you? And you could just see like this weight lifted off of her shoulders. And that's the damage that we're doing to these girls, is we're we're collapsing them down into and reinforcing, feminine stereotypes rather than expanding their options. And that's why I think feminism is so important for these girls. Is we had made progress through the 80s of expanding that. Through the 70s and 80s, there was a lot more room. Boys and girls in my childhood all looked more or less the same. They all had the same basic sort of medium cut length hair and all wear t-shirts and track pants. Like nowadays, and there were popular media representations like David Bowie and Annie Lennox and Grace Jones. Like we had representation in the media for gender nonconformity, and that's all collapsed down. And we think that, we're expanding that. We have all these gender categories now, like cake gender and cat gender, but it's actually not expanding our options. It's because kids are being taught that if I'm not Barbie, then I'm not a girl. I'm something else.
Yeah, I'm glad you shared that, because I think the that particular story with the girl that you shared, like it's interesting to me. Um I don't know if this is like a girl thing or a neurodivergent thing or whatever. I kind of relate to the experience of having a preset idea of a standard, um, and then trying to fit that instead of realizing, well, I already embody everything required to pass the threshold of meeting that standard, right? So for womanhood, you're already biologically female. You've already passed the test, right? Like that's pretty much all you need.
Yeah.
And there seems it's almost like a reversal of like the way it's supposed to be, right? Whereas you're supposed to be like, I'm a female, I'm a woman, so whatever I do is what a woman would do. It seems like
Yeah.
it's reversed, and it's like, well, I'm nothing right now, and I have to be this thing, or I have to follow these rules in order to become this thing. And I don't know how much that's, well, actually I do know that has actually played a pretty big role in like my gender experience, because um even as a trans person, it was really nice because now you have a standard of what rules to follow as a trans person. If you want to be a man, there's standards and rules you can follow to be a man. And it was actually through trying to measure myself up to those standards and those rules that I realized that there really is no way to do this like the right way. You cannot start with the rules and the standards and then work backwards. You have to start with who you are and your intuition and what makes you feel good, and what is most comfortable for you. It seems like in the case of that girl, she was not doing that. She wasn't thinking what is most comfortable for me first. And I, sorry, that's my dog. She freaks out whenever she hears anybody. She's a very funny dog. But yeah.
Well, we have
So
to start from the biological reality of the fact that we are female, and which means absolutely everything that we do from that point forward is a female experience,
yes,
including being a trans man.
exactly, and to recognize that like there's like a universal experience there. I think for me that was like a huge weight off my shoulders moment, because it was like, well, I finally have a club in a way. It's like a very frivolous way of saying it, but I finally have a community where I know there's going to be some set of shared experiences. And I've found that since kind of acknowledging that, my relationships with women, or my ability to relate to women, has actually improved quite a bit. Whereas before I felt like there was always some kind of disconnect. Realizing that like being female is the experience by which we're all kind of like united, and that was actually like a big helper for me to realize like it doesn't even really matter if what I look like, or how I dress or act. Even like whatever pronouns I use, at the end of the day, like what matters is that we're able to relate based on an experience. And talking about like where we are in life, or how we fit ourselves into society, the fact that we have each other, I think, is something that we really need to remember, because um, ultimately that's like it's kind of all we got. So
Yeah.
it's yeah. I think I'm glad that you were there for girls like that, to kind of like talk to them about that stuff, because I feel like that's probably done a whole lot of good for people.
I hope so. I wasn't allowed to be there for them for very long, but I'm trying to find ways of still being for them in some way.
Yeah, I think your website is a great start to that. And if you ever want like a hand making content, or anything, or if you want to like ever discuss anything in the future, like let me know, absolutely, because I'm very much on board with providing like more friendly opportunities and options for girls out there. So definitely you've sold me on that part. So
Wonderful.
yeah, any way I can
I
help.
would welcome your feedback. So I look forward to
Yeah,
keeping in touch, maintaining a relationship, and
Absolutely. Well,
working on some stuff together.
hell yeah, hell yeah. And if there's anything else ever that I can do, you just let me know. But trying to think, is there anything you'd like to talk about still, or do you feel like we've covered everything?
We've covered everything that I was hoping to talk about.
Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, pretty much same here. I was taking a few notes, like as you were talking, so I could ask questions later. But I think I've pretty much asked everything I wanted to. So unless there's anything else, if you wanna tell people where they can find you and what your social links are, I'll make sure that they're in the description when I upload this. So, but
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah, so my website is AGKimberly.com. From there, people can link to my socials, but I'm on Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube, and Instagram. Search of my name should get them there. I think my Twitter handle is Kimber_tweets.
cool, awesome. All right, well, y'all, if you're whoever's watching this, thank you guys so much. And Aaron, I appreciate you joining us today. This has been great.
It has been great. I appreciate the invitation. Let's keep in touch.
Absolutely, we absolutely will. All righty.